chapter 17. I got my other thingies done. The earthing thing. That's what I was looking for. It had fallen off of my display, my symbology display over there. So if the two amber lights light up, you're good. If anything else lights up, you're not. And that's a chart there, but who cares? If it don't work, it don't work. At that point, you just call an electrician or whatever. So, alrighty. The hospital didn't have any record of the Garretts. Yeah, right. Okay, I have headset on. Headset has to be on, but it also has to be plugged in, preferably. All right. The hospital didn't have any record of the Garretts. The drive to the high school was only about 2 miles, but it seemed like it took forever to Mark. He thought it must seem even longer to Lisa. At the high school, they found the Red Cross in charge of the gym. Okay, no comment. Bite my tongue. There were over 300 people living there. Mark was thankful his family wasn't reduced to this option. He explained the situation to one of the ladies from the Red Cross, and she pulled out a long list of names. She flicked back through some pages and started reading down the list. "I'm sorry," she said, "we don't have any Garretts listed with the people from the fire. Maybe they're staying with someone in town." Lisa started to shake and then to cry. "I don't know where else to look," she sobbed. "All of our friends I know of lived in the same neighborhood." She started crying, and Mark reached out to pat her on the back. She turned and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her head into his shoulder. She was crying so loudly and squeezing him so tightly that it was hard for him to breathe. He patted her back and told her they would look until they found them. Mark had never seen Lisa be anything but cool and collected. Jim had told him she was extremely close to her parents. But Mark hadn't imagined she could lose it like this. He felt awkward and didn't know what to say or do or say. Jess was just the opposite of Lisa when something like this happened. And Mark had never had to deal with a situation like this. He wished Jim or Jess were here. They would know what to do. "Lisa," a voice called out. "Lisa, is that you?" Lisa pulled her head out of Mark's shoulder. "Mom, oh God, Mom, it's really you. They said you weren't here. Where's Dad?" "He's on the other side of the gym, playing cards. I was going to the ladies' room when I heard someone crying, and when I came closer to see what was going on, it was you," Mrs. Garrett said. "I don't understand," Lisa explained. "They said you weren't on the list of people from the fire?" The Red Cross lady frantically looked through her list again. "Here they are," she explained. "They're on the list of people stranded in town." "That's because we were at the grocery store when the burst hit, and we couldn't get home in our car," Alice stated. "We finally found a ride back home, but by the time we got there, the whole neighborhood was engulfed in flames. We had nowhere to go and nothing to wear, so we came here." "I'm so glad we found you. I was afraid you'd been killed," Lisa cried with tears of joy now. "You always jump to the wrong conclusion, the worst conclusion. How many times have I told you to be more positive?" Alice scolded. "Why don't we go see your father?" "I'm sorry about the mix-up," the Red Cross lady apologized. "It's okay," Lisa responded as she, her mother, and the 3 men headed to the other side of the gym. When they found Lisa's dad, she hugged him hard enough to make an anaconda proud. She reintroduced them to Mark, whom they vaguely remembered. Then she introduced them to the Watson brothers. While Lisa and her parents were catching up, Tony told Mark that they needed to head home. Mark asked them to wait just a couple minutes. He then interrupted the Garretts' visit with their only child. "Lisa, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Watsons need to get home, and so do we." "But Mark, can't we stay just a few more minutes?" "What for?" "So I can visit with my parents," she answered him indignantly. Can't you visit with them on the way back?" "You mean they can come with us?" "Well, of course they can." "Young man, we wouldn't want to be a burden," George Garrett said emphatically. "Mr. Garrett, any family of Jim and Lisa's is family of ours. Plus, I can already think of about a dozen things I can use your help on." "I appreciate that, son, but I can't do that much work since my stroke. I won't be much help, I'm afraid." "I have plenty of strong backs, Mr. Garrett. It's knowledge I need. So if you don't mind, why don't we get your stuff and hit the road?" "Young man, you drive a hard bargain." "I'll accept under one condition. And that's for you to call me George." The older gentleman extended his hand. "Well then, George, I think we've got a deal." Mark grabbed his hand and shook it. Lisa was as happy as Mark had seen her since the burst. It only took the Garretts a minute to collect the few possessions they'd brought or been given since the fire destroyed their house. They thanked the Red Cross people for their hospitality and headed to the jeeps. The trip seemed short with everyone filling each other in on the events of the week, but before long, Mark was pulling in to his driveway. Gunny's truck was there. When the twins saw their grandparents, they ran up and launched themselves into the waiting arms of George and Alice. Jim came running up and hugged his in-laws as well. They all went over to the picnic table and started catching up. Jess came out of the house with Sam and David. Mark hugged the kids and kissed his wife. "What happened to your hand?" she asked. "Oh, I just got stupid for a minute and cut it." Lisa bandaged it up and said it'll be okay. "Where's Gunny?" "I'll give you 3 guesses, but you only need 1, Jess answered with a wink. "I invited them both for supper, so they should be along shortly." Jim asked Mark to come look at what they had in the shed. When Mark walked in, he saw some 55-gallon metal drums. "What are these for?" he asked, pretty sure he already knew the answer. "They're for the fuel. Gunny knows this guy who sells barrels for a living. We bought 10 of them. We can put the gas we get out of the non-working cars into them. He also sells those blue water barrels. I figure if everyone in the neighborhood bought 1 or 2, we could cut back on how often we have to pump water. He even has some large water tanks, but they're pretty expensive." "This is awesome. Did you get any groceries?" "Yes, the Kroger got a shipment in, and we each got another $50 worth. The manager said they felt they could keep this up until the lights came back on. He also told me they were issuing credit to anyone who didn't have cash. I asked him if that was a corporate decision, and he told me it was, but rumor had it the government had strongly suggested they do it, and they'd reimburse Kroger for any losses. I figured we'll need to ferry everyone into town again. David has some good news, too." "Yes, David, what did you find out?" "Well, most of the people here worked at things that won't help us much, but there's one exception. You know Mr. Hernandez, Fred? Mr. Vasquez?" "He's really Dr. Vasquez." "A doctor?" Mark was surprised. "Not a people doctor, a vet. He said he has a lot of stuff at his office and was thinking about asking you if you could help him bring it to his house," David said, smiling. "That's great, son. I'm sure we can do that. Did you find any gardening equipment?" "Yes, 3 rototillers and lots of hand tools." "Excellent. Anything else?" "Quite a few people have hobbies that might be useful. Mrs. Peterson was really excited by one of the ladies who has a lot of jars for canning. I think the best thing one of the men has is a big welding shop. One of the men has a big welding shop. He said he can weld most anything. He's really a plumber, but he learned to weld in the Army. One of the other guys said he'd be used to be into CBs a lot. He said he has several radios in storage and that maybe he could get some of them to work. There were some other things Mrs. Peterson thought might be useful, and she wrote them down." "Son, that's wonderful. You did an excellent job." David's face lit up. "Thanks, Dad." Mark went back to the house to check on how Sam did with the venison. She'd cut it all up and was marinating it. Mark bragged on her and thanked her for watching the girls. Supper was ready, and Gunny and Abby showed up just in time. Introductions were made all around, and they sat down to eat. As they ate, George and Alice filled everyone in on how it was to live in a shelter for a week. "There was no privacy whatsoever. That was the hardest part for me," Alice said. "I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy," George agreed. "We lost our house and all of our belongings, but the thing I missed most was being able to have a private conversation with my wife." After supper, it was time for the president's speech. They all gathered around the radio. "My fellow Americans, I come to you tonight with some great news. Limited power has been restored to Washington, D.C., and some of the other major East Coast cities. Most of this power is being allotted to hospitals and other essential service providers. While we may still be a few days away from total power restoration, this is a promising first step. In spite of this wonderful news, I have some disturbing news as well. I am very concerned with the rioting and lawlessness that continue to plague some of our major cities. Most of the citizens in the majority of the cities and towns in our great nation have worked together for the common good. I would hope that everyone would follow the example set by most of the country. If the rioting is not stopped in the few trouble spots by tomorrow, I will have no choice but to declare limited martial law in those areas. This is a measure I hope not to be forced into undertaking, but we will not tolerate the murder and mayhem that has been infecting these areas. I pray that you and your families are safe, and I ask you to pray for our country and its leadership in this crisis. Help your neighbors and your community. Thank you for your time. I will talk with you tomorrow. God bless. Please stay tuned to KSTX for the news and an important announcement. The major items in the news were the announcement that the Kroger stores had resupplied and that people could buy more groceries, and that the water was going to be off in the city for 12 hours starting at 7 p.m. tonight. Citizens were forbidden to store any more water than they needed for drinking and cooking for those 12 hours. The city water board said it was to do some maintenance on the pumps, but Mark thought it was to let them get enough water pumped up into the tanks to maintain the water pressure. The weatherman said that they should enjoy the cooler weather for another day or two, but then it should be warming back up. Just before the news ended, the announcer explained that the radio station had been running off an old backup system powered by a diesel generator. They only stored enough fuel to run for a week, as they never expected it to take longer than that to get the power back on. He went on to say they'd been resupplied a couple days ago, but they were unsure of when any more fuel would be counted on. Beginning tonight, the station would cut back their broadcast to 5 hours a day until the crisis was resolved. They would broadcast 2 hours in the morning, an hour at noon, and 2 hours in the evening. Mark wasn't sure, but he thought he heard the newsman's voice crack. The whole group headed down to John's house for the meeting. The discussions were as spirited as Mark had seen them since the day the lights went out. Some people were encouraged by the news of some power being restored. Others thought it was nothing more than a ruse to buy the government a few more days. Most were skeptical at best. Another argument was over the wisdom of declaring martial law. Some said it was necessary to save the embattled cities from ruin. Others felt it was an overextension of the president's power and that it would set a dangerous precedent. Mark listened to the arguments from both sides. Each made good points, but Mark didn't know which side was right. Once that discussion died down, Mark spoke to the group. I have something I want to present to you all. I'd first like to introduce to you George and Alice Garrett. They are Lisa Davis's parents. Their home in Uvalde was burned to the ground by a small airplane that crashed in their neighborhood, and then when the burst hit. They were living in the Uvalde High School gym, but now they'll be staying with us. George and Alice, until they retired, were farmers and did some ranching. None of us knows how long the power is going to be out, but it seems we all think it's prudent to assume it's not coming back on in the near future. We don't know how much longer Kroger is going to be able to sell food, so I think we need to try to start growing our own. Everybody here has at least an acre of land, and there are 15 empty lots that could be turned into gardens. If we work together, we could get in some fall gardens and probably be able to get some food out of them in 6 to 8 weeks. Mark stopped to let what he'd said sink in. I don't have time to take care of that, John said flatly. Just taking care of security is becoming a full-time job. Maybe someone else could help us out, Mark suggested. So what do we need to do? Someone in the crowd asked after a minute. I think the first thing we ought to do is form a committee to study and plan what the best course of action is. We know we have some gardening equipment in the neighborhood, and between George and some of the others, we have the knowledge. We have lots of labor available, so all we need is the raw material. I would suggest a 4 or 5 person committee to be selected to present us with a plan in 2 or 3 days. There were murmurs of approval from the crowd. I nominate you, Mark, to head up the committee, someone shouted. Thanks, but this isn't my strong suit. I may be a bean counter, but I never counted the kind of beans we're talking about now. I think George would be the logical candidate to head the committee. He doesn't even live here, John shouted. He doesn't have as much stake as the rest of us. John, he does live here. He's staying with me and has just as much stake as the rest of us. We're all trying to get our families through this mess. George is the only one here I know of who's made a living off of the land. Unless there's someone else more qualified, I believe he's the best man for the job. It was quiet for a long moment. I second the nomination of George Garrett to head the gardening committee, Professor Petrie said. Mark smiled gratefully at the professor. All those in favor? I'll take care of that, John said. All in favor? A hearty aye rose from the crowd. All those opposed? Not a sound was heard. Mark looked at John and saw that he was standing with his arms folded. Well, I guess the ayes have it, he spat. Now we need some people to help, Mark said. Does anyone have any gardening experience who would like to help? 4 hands went up, 2 women and 2 men. Please give your names to George, and you all set a time for your meeting. Today is Wednesday. Could you have a plan to present to us at the meeting Friday evening? Mark asked. He was greeted by hearty nods of the head. It got really quiet for a minute. Are you going to be able to take us to the Kroger again, Mark? Sherry Henderson asked. I'm busy for the next 3 days, but I know how badly everyone needs to go to the store, so if it's okay with him, I'd like to lend my truck to John. He's done a great job of organizing the food runs, and if it's all right with him, he can arrange to ferry you all back and forth tomorrow. John looked shocked at first, and then the Iceman attitude he'd been displaying melted. Yeah, sure, I can do that. But if the lines are long, we can probably only get 2 groups done tomorrow. Actually, John, if you don't mind the suggestion, I was thinking you could use the truck like a bus. Make a round trip every hour or so and drop off and pick up as people are ready. That way everyone could go in one day. Yes, that would work, I guess. Is there anything else? Yes, the man David had pointed out to Mark earlier as the man with the welding shop raised his hand. Mark didn't remember seeing him at a meeting before. He was huge. Yes, sir, John said. Please don't call me sir. My name is Daniel Lopez, but my friends call me Chaparro. Mark noticed that all of the Hispanics at the meeting chuckled at the man's name. Mark would have to ask Manny about it. Okay, Chaparro, what's on your mind? I heard that some of you got a Marine to give you a security evaluation and that he made some recommendations of things we should do. Where do we stand on that, and could he brief the whole group? I'm not finished evaluating everything Sergeant Pickwell suggested, John said. Well, we can at least hear what he had to say. Can we at least hear what he had to say? I guess so. If you'd like to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, Gunny's here, Mark said enthusiastically. John shot him a drop-dead look. Gunny, would you come up and briefly go over what you said to us yesterday? John's shoulders were slumped. Gunny got up in front of the group and laid out what he'd told Mark, Jim, and John the day before. Mark could see John visibly stiffen as Gunny spoke. When he was done, Chaparro asked his question again. So where do we stand on all that? Like I said, I haven't had time to review everything, John answered impatiently. Don't you think we should get started on it, Chaparro suggested. I will as soon as I can. Maybe we should form another committee to study the plans, Professor Petrie suggested. That's a good idea, someone shouted. Now wait a minute, John began. A chorus of people supporting the formation of a security committee drowned out the rest of what John said. He folded his arms and plopped down in a chair. We could do that, Mark said loudly, enough to quiet the crowd. Who do we want to head up the committee? Mark saw Dr. Vasquez's hand go up. I think you should do it, Mark. He stated, I don't think I'm the right person for this committee either. I don't have any military experience. Then get Gunny to do it. Mark didn't recognize the voice. John jumped out of his chair like it was hot all of a sudden. Now wait a minute. Gunny doesn't live here. I think that excludes him from being on a committee. John's comments started the crowd murmuring again. After a moment, Mark asked the crowd to quiet down. I think John has a good point. Anyone on a committee should probably live here, but that doesn't stop the committee from bringing in any special advisors they deem fit. Does that seem okay to everyone? There was a chorus of affirmative answers. Does anyone have any combat experience? No hands went up. Most of the residents of Silver Hills were too young to have served in Vietnam and too old for Desert Storm or Enduring Freedom. Does anyone have any military experience? Only 2 hands went up, John's and Chaparro's. Most of you know that John spent 4 years with the Marines in logistics and supply. Chaparro, what did you do? I was in the Army for 12 years doing heavy equipment maintenance. I never saw combat, but I was close a couple times. Mark thought that he'd rather have this guy chair the committee. It seemed he had some sense of urgency about security as Mark. The same sense of urgency about security as Mark. John seemed to be threatened by Gunny, and that might get in his way of doing what was best for the community. He thought about asking the group to vote, but that would cause a problem no matter the outcome. If Chaparro won, John would be very bitter. And if John won, then who knows what might happen with security. Suddenly, the solution came to Mark. Since we have 2 well-qualified veterans, does anyone see a problem with them co-chairing the security committee? No one said anything. Well, since there are no objections, I guess you guys have the job. Who would like to help these fellows out? We still want you to be on the committee, Mark, Professor Petrie said. You may not be a military man, but you do know about self-defense. Mark thought for a moment. I'll tell you what, Professor, I'll do it if you'll do it. Well, okay. Anyone else? One of the women's hands went up. I think it might be a good idea if you had a female on the committee. After all, we care about security as much as you do. Plus, we can make sure you boys don't turn this into some kind of G.I. Joe fantasy. The murmur of female agreement was unmistakable. How about you, ma'am? Mark asked. Me? The woman stammered. No, I'm just a single mom concerned about my kids. I don't know anything about security. I just think a woman might think of some things you men might overlook. I'm sure one of the women here must have some experience that would be useful to the committee. Mark looked around. How about it? Any of you women want to help us out? No one said anything. Well, ma'am, Mark looked at the single mom. Looks to me like you're the one. If you don't do it, who will? Okay, I will. I guess that's what I get for opening my big mouth, she answered. Thanks, Mark said with a smile. John, Chaparro, when do you want to get together? Tomorrow after the meeting, Chaparro asked, looking at John. I guess so. Is that okay with everyone else? Chaparro said. All of the other security committee members nodded their heads. Mark looked at John. Anything else? John shook his head. I guess we'll see everybody tomorrow. If you need to go to the grocery store in the morning, come see me and we'll figure out the bus schedule. George got the members of his committee for a moment, and then Mark's group walked back to his house. Gunny excused himself to go say goodbye to Abby before he had to leave. She came back with him and brought some clothes for Alice. George, who was close to the same size as Mark, was given 2 pairs of jeans and half a dozen shirts out of Mark's closet. Everyone was fairly tired from the long day, and shortly after dark they headed to bed. George and Alice slept in the bed that was the twins had been using in the pop-up, and the dining room and benches in the camper were converted into a bed for the girls. Mark, before going to bed, went into his bedroom and put $1 in his black box. He wondered what tomorrow would bring.